Sup guys, a new mechanic has been introduced in the EX stage of the current event. There are two versions of the fight, depending on whether you use a solo vanguard or not. If you use a solo vanguard, the boss has 1.5 million HP with the usual 9999 accuracy, so it's a typical EX stage where you must dodge everything manually or you'll get melted pretty quickly. If you're not using a solo vanguard, the boss has 2 million HP with much lower accuracy and damage, but higher evasion and luck as well. Since this version of the boss has more HP, evasion, and you're using more ships, naturally your score will be much lower as well. However, it pretty much turns into a punching bag that is pretty easily autoable. If you just want 500 awakening chips for clearing the stage, then you should avoid using a solo vanguard. Keep in mind that it isn't always the case that light cruiser enemies have light armor, as the Mogami enemy in chapter 14 has medium armor, but for whatever reason the Pamiat here has light armor. Since the boss has light armor, doesn't do too much damage, and moves a little bit but not too much, it actually turns out to be a pretty good spot to test light armor damage, which couldn't be done against the raid event Huanchan EX stage. The only slight problem is that unlike the raid EX stage, the time limit is much longer, so you'll want to build a fleet that can end the fight at more or less the same time every single run. All the footage of my testing as well as the spreadsheet where I gathered the results will be in the description if you want to look over them. First, I wanted to find out if the new French torps in the gear lab are noticeably stronger than quad mags against light armor. Looking at the French torps on paper, they deal 182 base damage per hit, and when multiplied by 1.3 for their light armor mod, comes out to 236.6. As for quad mags, they deal 145 damage per hit, multiplied by 0.8 for their light armor mod, coming out to 116 damage. Multiply 116 damage per hit by 2 hits, and it comes out to 232 damage, which is almost equivalent to a single hit of the French torps. This means that if the French torps can land just half as many hits as the quad mags on average, they can actually be stronger against the single light armor enemy. One more thing to note is that the French torps are 1 second faster than the quad mags before reload is accounted for, so it could be possible for the French torps to get off an extra salvo just before the battle ends. I tested the torps on Unzen, who has a regular torp spread, and Kazagumo, who has reduced torp spread. What I want to test here is whether or not the French torps have a high enough hit rate to be stronger than quad mags per salvo, so I used gold burns to make sure the two torps have almost exactly the same cooldown, and therefore the difference in damage won't be due to just a difference in number of torps launched. Although the extra reload could increase non-torpedo damage by a bit, it shouldn't skew the results too much. We can take that into account in the end if the difference is too close to call. For the main fleet, I just chose a relatively consistent set of ships that could finish the boss at around the same time every trial, making sure to avoid ships that would impact the damage of the vanguard too much. With this setup, every fight ended between 3 minutes and 11 seconds to 3 minutes and 10 seconds remaining. Because the duration of the battles are longer than usual, I felt comfortable leaving the sample size at 5 runs each. Looking at the results, we can see that quad mags won out by a bit, both in terms of average and consistency. Once again, keep in mind that this is with their cooldowns equalized, meaning that on a per salvo basis, the quad mags hit more than double the amount of torps compared to the French torps on average. But in practice, if the French torps can get an extra salvo out, then obviously they would end up winning. For instance, in this gear off meta fight, which lasts 87 seconds, Unzen with 2 plus 13 Oxy torps can just squeeze out one more salvo with 3 seconds remaining in the fight, as you can see in the footage. In this second clip, she's using quad mags and can't get off that last salvo in time. If instead of Unzen you were using a destroyer with much higher reload, for example Shimakaze, she might be able to get off that last salvo with quad mags as well, and then quad mags might be able to win out. In Operation Siren fights, you get an extra 10 seconds, in which case quad mags would be able to fire the same number of torpedoes on Unzen as well, so they should end up being the better option. After testing the torpedoes, I then wanted to see which Vanguard deals the highest DPS against light armor, with the candidates being Taiyuan, Hindenburg, and Unzen. While I'm going over these tests, keep in mind that the results are specific to my equipment upgrades and fleet tech. You probably don't have the exact same setups as me, so while it is fine to use my results as a reference, how these ships perform for you might be different based on those factors. For example, I'm using a plus 13 Unzen gun and a plus 10 Drake gun on my Hindenburg. If you have a plus 13 Drake gun as well, then your Hindenburg will obviously deal a little bit more damage than mine, everything else equal. If you don't have the gun plates to spare for any Vanguard Rainbow guns at all, then Hindenburg will suffer relatively harder than Taiyuan, for example, who gets a lot of her damage from her missile, which should be easier to upgrade for just 120 auxiliary plates. I'm using the same main fleet as before for consistent clear times. The cats used do not specifically increase the damage of destroyers or heavy cruisers, so they should not bias the results in one way or another. Looking at the results, we can see that Hindenburg and Taiyuan are extremely close, with Unzen being just slightly behind but not by much. Between the two sets of tests, Taiyuan dealt a bit more damage with Unzen than Hindenburg, because the battle would last an extra second or two from Unzen dealing just a bit less damage than Hindenburg. Considering that Unzen is a torp ship without torp spread reduction, it is not surprising that her damage is not as high when there is only a single enemy. It is best to use her against either heavy armor enemies, or in places where there are multiple enemies so she can have better hit rates on her torpedoes. Between Taiyuan and Hindenburg, there are a few factors to consider outside their damage with the specific given equipments. In favor of Hindenburg, she completely ignores shields, receives a buff from Bismarck's Way, who is good in almost all situations, and is permanently available. On the other hand, Taiyuan Retrofit requires much less effort to obtain if you played during her event compared to a DR ship, and the Unzen gun is also an event-limited piece of equipment. Having serviceable gold equipment in Tash Gun and the missile also make Taiyuan much cheaper to get going. At the end of the day though, we are comparing a rainbow ship to a purple to gold retrofit, and while Taiyuan is comparable against light against Hindenburg, Hindenburg is going to be the more useful ship overall, along with her much higher level of investment required. Once again, I encourage you to do your own testing based on what you have to see the relevant results for yourself. Anyways, that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed and see you in the next one.